Who should partake of the Lord's Supper? Only Christians should partake of the Lord's Supper. I think it's interesting to see what they did under the Old Testament in regards to the Passover. Exodus 12, verse 48. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. According to Genesis 17, verses 10 and following, circumcision was necessary to enter into God's covenant. Only those who had been circumcised could partake of the Passover. In a similar manner, only Christians are to partake of the Lord's Supper. The Bible describes our conversion to Christianity as a spiritual circumcision made without hands. Colossians 2, verse 11. In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. Another reason only Christians should partake of the Lord's Supper is found in the following verses. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 15. I speak as to wise men, judge for yourself what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? Matthew 26, verse 29. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. When we partake of the Lord's Supper, we are in fellowship with Jesus in the kingdom, or we could say in the church. So this tells us that only Christians should partake of the Lord's Supper because non-Christians have not been added to the kingdom/church by God, which means they cannot be in fellowship with Jesus. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14, 2 John 1, and verse number 9. We also need to consider that when we partake of the Lord's Supper, we are supposed to examine ourselves on how we've been living our lives for God. How can a non-Christian do this when they haven't become a Christian yet? Since we are supposed to know what we are doing when we partake of the Lord's Supper, this rules out young children because they don't understand what the Lord's Supper is all about. Also, you cannot find one example where a child or a non-Christian partook of the Lord's Supper in the Bible. So only Christians should partake of the Lord's Supper.